Continuing Chapter 1 of Capitalism and Its Critics. Boltz was pursuing a vendetta. He had been kicked out of India, some of his business partners had been arrested, and a few months before his book appeared, the British government, at the behest of the company, had ordered him to pay a 30% tax on the profits he had garnered from his trading. Unable to pay the bill, he was declared bankrupt in 1773. Historians have cast doubt on some of Bolt's assertions, including his claim that certain Indian winders of raw silk, who was known as Nagads, became so enraged how the company was treating them that they cut off their own thumbs to avoid being forced to work. Boltz's allegation that the ravages of the famine could be traced to Clive's campaign to suppress competition was outlandish. In a March 1772 parliamentary debate, Clive himself remarked, how a monopoly of salt, betel nut, and tobacco in the years 1765 and 1766 could occasion a want of rain and scarcity of rice is past my comprehension. Still, for all of Boltz's unreliability as a witness, many of the abuses that he identified were subsequently confirmed by other accounts, including an internal company report that was prepared later in the 1770s for one of its top executives. In Bengal, the anonymous author of the report wrote, the company went to market as sovereigns and tyrants. Rather than gaining the cooperation of local producers and paying the market prices, its local representatives forced the manufacturers to work for them and to work at an underprice, at the same time that they prohibited private merchants from dealing with them. In this manner, a general monopoly was at once rigorously established. In modern terms, the company report provided a textbook description of a particular type of monopoly known as a monopsony, a market in which a single large buyer can exploit its leverage over many small sellers who have no alternative to dealing with it. Once the company had driven out its French and Dutch competitors, it had an enormous amount of market power. And as Boltz and the anonymous report noted, it didn't hesitate to exploit this position. And yet, for all these advantages, the company had managed to get itself into financial difficulty by paying such high dividends. In the summer of 1772, shortly after Boltz's book was published, its directors, having seen the Indian business collapse during the famine, were forced to ask the British government for a bailout, a loan of at least £1 million. The news that the mighty East India Company was virtually bankrupt prompted a financial panic, in which a number of banks failed. And in a development that foreshadowed the global financial crisis of 2007 to 2009, the news that it was asking Parliament for a rescue caused widespread outrage. In another precursor, the government of Lord North, the Tory grandee who would lead Britain through most of the American Revolutionary War, decided that the company was too big and important to be allowed to fail. It accounted for roughly half of Britain's foreign trade, and it was by far the country's biggest taxpayer. Moreover, many members of Parliament were shareholders. Negotiations dragged on through the first half of 1773. Eventually, the government agreed to extend the company a loan of £1.4 million. Simultaneously, Parliament asserted some control over its operations. In the Regulating Act of 1783 and the East India Act of 1784, Parliament created the post of Governor-General of Bengal, the occupant of which would supposedly exercise ultimate authority over the company's operations in Bengal, Madras, and Bombay. The legislation also created a new government-appointed Executive Council in Calcutta and a Bengal Supreme Court, with 4 English judges to resolve trading disputes. The government appointed Warren Hastings, an independent-minded company veteran, as the first Governor-General of Bengal. During his time in India, Hastings would overhaul the company's business affairs and build some essential public infrastructure, including granaries and a postal service. Despite these improvements, the reforms failed to resolve the fundamental conflicts of interest that Boltz had identified, and many of the company's onerous practices remained in place, including the hefty land taxes that impoverished many Indian farmers. In 1782, some farmers in Dinajpur and Rangpur, 2 areas that are now in Bangladesh, rose up in revolt. The following year, there was another violent uprising in neighboring Awadh. A new drought in Bengal and further military conflicts in the south added to the company's difficulties. Despite having repaid its government loan, it found itself in renewed financial difficulties. In March 1783, its directors asked Parliament for another bailout, which caused more public outrage. By this stage, Bolts had left England. After being declared bankrupt, he moved across the English Channel, where, with the backing of some Belgian financiers, he launched several new trading ventures to India and Africa. None of these schemes enjoyed enduring success, and by 1782 he was again bankrupt. Ever hopeful, he sought out more backers for a venture to ship goods from the northwestern coast of America to China and Japan. That plan didn't work out either, and Bolts subsequently struggled to find financial backers. He spent some time in Portugal, where his business career had started. When he died in 1808, at the age of 70, he was forgotten and reportedly living in a Paris poorhouse. But some of his criticisms of corporate capitalism would live on, even if they weren't widely associated with him. Chapter 2. Adam Smith on Colonial Capitalism and Slavery. On June 27, 1772, David Hume, the great Scottish philosopher, penned a letter from his home in Edinburgh to his friend Adam Smith, a former professor of moral philosophy at Glasgow University, who he knew was working on a book about the economy. We are here in a very melancholy situation. Continual bankruptcies, universal loss of credit, and endless suspicions, Hume wrote. Do these events anywise affect your theory? Or will it occasion the revisal of any chapters? A couple of weeks earlier, a Scottish financial house known as the Ayr Bank had collapsed, setting off a financial panic that rattled the money centers in Edinburgh, London, and Amsterdam. The financial troubles of the East India Company and its request for a government bailout were also in the news. There is no record of what Smith replied to Hume. When he received the letter, he was living in his hometown of Kirkcaldy, Fife. Some years earlier, he had taken leave of his professorship for a better paid post, tutoring the young Duke of Buccleuch. Approaching 50, Smith had already published one highly acclaimed book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, in which he examined the basis of morality. The new book he was working on addressed the question of why some countries got rich while others stayed poor. Despite his reputation as an absent-minded professor, Smith followed current events closely, and he was politically connected. During the previous decade, he had acted as an informal advisor to Charles Townshend, who had served as president of the Board of Trade and was then Chancellor of the Exchequer in the Whig government of William Pitt the Elder. It was Townshend who had imposed hefty import duties in the American colonies, including tariffs on tea that the East India Company transported from Asia, a policy that was causing great ruptures. Smith didn't have anything to do with the tariffs, but he remained close to the Whigs. In 1776, the year the 13 American colonies declared their independence, Smith finally published his book, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. Usually referred to by the last four words of its title, it was a landmark in economic thought. In the opening chapters, Smith argued that the key to rising productivity and economic growth is the division of labor, in which production is split up into a number of different tasks, with each worker concentrating on an individual one. To illustrate his point, he described how a workshop that made metal pins divided production into about 18 distinct operations, including drawing out the wire, straightening it, cutting it, grinding it, and attaching the pinhead to it. If 10 workers carried out all these tasks themselves, they could each make at most 20 pins a day, Smith said. By having them concentrate on individual tasks, the workshop produced 48,000 pins each day, a truly massive increase in productivity. Smith's famous description of a pin workshop is a reminder that manufacturing was common in Britain well before the opening of Cromford Mill, but it was mostly small-scale manufacturing. Foreshadowing a debate that continues to this day, Smith insisted that the fruits of increased production and higher productivity trickle down to everybody, including the poor. It is the great multiplication of the productions of all the different arts, he wrote. in consequence of the division of labor, which occasions in a well-governed society that universal opulence which extends itself to the lowest ranks of the people. Smith said the key to achieving this outcome was to rely on a competitive market system, which coordinated production without any central control and prevented any individual or group from hogging all the gains. In a competitive market of this nature, he wrote, the pursuit of profit by a businessman or tradesman guides his actions and investments in a direction which is most agreeable to the interests of the whole society, as if he were led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. Based upon Smith's exposition of the division of labor and the invisible hand, he is usually portrayed as an enthusiastic proponent of free market capitalism, or what he referred to as commercial society. Broadly speaking, this characterization is accurate. Years before Smith published The Wealth of Nations, he wrote elsewhere, little else is requisite to carry a state to the highest degree of opulence from the lowest barbarism, but peace, easy taxes, and a tolerable administration of justice, all the rest being brought about by the natural course of things. All governments which thwart this natural course are unnatural, and to support themselves are obliged to be oppressive and tyrannical. In his 2023 book, Visions of Inequality, the economist Branko Milanovic, a leading scholar of global income disparities, pointed out that Smith's faith in the free market was partly based on a conviction that it led to high incomes and wages, which Smith called the very essence of public opulence. As Milanovic also emphasized, Smith's emphasis on raising wages and living standards marked a major break with prior economic doctrines, which regarded wealth and treasure, particularly gold and silver bullion, as the main measure of a country's strength and well-being. But though Smith certainly believed in the power of free commerce and competitive markets to generate growth and prosperity, there was another side to him that often gets overlooked. Even as he defended the general principle of organizing society on the basis of private enterprise and profit-seeking, he was deeply suspicious of individual business owners and tradesmen because of their tendency to eliminate competition and stiff their customers whenever they could. People of the same trade seldom meet together, he wrote, even for merriment and diversion, but the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public, or in some contrivance to raise prices. Smith was even more dubious about large-scale business, particularly merchant capitalist enterprises like the East India Company, which had been founded on the basis of royal monopoly grants. In trying to justify their privileged and protected status that these businesses enjoyed, their defenders argued it would enable Britain to run a positive trade balance and build up its wealth. Although the trade monopolies were privately owned and operated, they were viewed effectively as arms of the state. During the early 17th century, Thomas Munn, a merchant who became a director of the East India Company, had expressed these arguments in a pair of books. Smith referred to the economic philosophy Munn expounded as mercantilism, and one of his goals in writing The Wealth of Nations was to challenge it. In a letter he wrote several years after the book's publication, he described it as a very violent attack upon the whole commercial system of Great Britain. If mercantilism was a form of capitalism, and it surely was, Smith was a noted critic of capitalism as well as its greatest philosopher.